Stay up on that rise, stay up on that rise, and never come down. Oh, stay up on that rise, stay up on that rise, and never come down. Mama said, don't give up, it's a little complicated. All tied up, no more love, and I'd hate to see you waiting. The seats all been done, but they haven't seen the best of it. So I got one more run, and it's gonna be a sight to see.
Soul, let go of your stimulus, let go of the chatter, cycle, put down the phone, radio, let's dive in.
Okay, we'll be getting started in a few minutes. Our panelists and members of the media, as you're getting joined, I'll be making a couple of announcements with some basic instructions for today's meeting and some details so that we can get today's event on and running smoothly. If you're a member of the media, we ask that you please identify yourself with your name and your media outlet on your Zoom profile. So to do that, if you go into the Zoom meeting and hover over your own image, and in the upper right corner, you hover your mouse, there's a little 3-dot menu there. And under that menu, there's an option to rename. And if you can put your first name, last name, and your media outlet in there, that'll help us to identify you when we take questions from the media during today's event. Take note of the chat message, the chat bubble down at the bottom of the screen. That's where you can chat to us your questions from the media. And if you're in the media and you have a question, we will invite you to ask it yourself if you'd like to, enabling your audio and or video to join the meeting and talk directly to the panelists. So let us know if you have a question and we'll invite you to ask it yourself, or I can ask it for you. We also have several questions planned ourselves for the expert, and we'll go ahead and get started with those once the meeting begins. No presentations or any major talk before getting to questions, straight into questions. So please do feel free to chat those questions as soon as you think of them, and we'll be inviting you to do so throughout the meeting. Carmen, if you can make sure to rename yourself with your full name and your university's name. If you hover your mouse over the upper corner of your video screen, there's a little menu with 3 dots in it.
Gotcha.
And under that menu, it'll have the option to rename.
Okay.
Matti Kummu at Aalto University, if you could do the same thing and rename yourself with your university's name on the end of your name. And I'll be repeating those instructions as we get people logging in. And we'll probably get started in about 5 minutes.
There is also another option to rename yourself under if you click on the participants list at the bottom and you see your name. you can just hover over your name there and you'll see a rename option, and you can rename yourself that way. I encourage everyone to rename themselves their full name and their affiliation, even if they're not a member of the media. That way we can sort everyone out.
Oh, and Sula can bring me on Monday morning, so it's fine.
Oh, brilliant.
We're going to be making sure to mute any people joining the meeting just to avoid any interruptions. Craig, I've enabled you as co-host if you can help to stay on top of that. I see we've got one of our other panelists here getting logged in. Hi, Stella, and hi, Ben. For both of you, if you could rename yourself in this meeting so that it shows also your university's name. And so if you click on the little 3-dot menu in the upper corner and just add your university onto the end of that, I think that will look good. And that's going to help our reporters, the media in the call, to identify each of the speakers. For media in attendance, please rename yourself as well so that we can identify who you are and what media outlet you're from. We're going to be taking questions from the media throughout today's panel. Hover over that 3-dot menu in the upper corner of your image, and there's an option under it that says rename, and you'll be able to add your media outlet onto the end of your on the end of your your media outlet on the end of your own name. We'll be getting started in just another minute or two. I want to give a few more minutes for people who have registered to go ahead and get logged in. Okay, we'll be starting in just another minute or two as the participants trickle in. Yes, I see a question in the chat from a reporter. Yes, the chat is the appropriate place to submit your questions. I'll be giving some instructions as we get started about all of that. First, I want to ask everyone in the media as well as our panelists to please make sure that your full name and your university name appears in your name on the panel on the Zoom program. It looks like everybody's got that from our panelists. Thank you so much for doing that. And if you could also, for the media, please indicate your full name and your media outlet as well. That'll help us to identify you when we get started and start taking questions from media. Take a look at the chat at the bottom. There's the little cartoon chat bubble. You can chat to us. You can chat directly to me. I'll be moderating and asking questions. Or chat to everyone. We'll invite media participants to go ahead and ask the question yourself. We'll invite you to enable your audio and video and go ahead and ask the question to the panel. If you don't want to do that, I can ask the question for you. We'll be getting started in just another minute with 1 or 2 questions for each panelist as we go around the room and taking questions from media throughout. And we'll try to come back to each panelist for questions as many times as we can going through the course of the hour. We'll also be recording today's session and providing a transcript of it and sending that to everyone who registered. So if you are a member of the media and you would find a video and a transcript helpful, but you didn't register for today's event, if you just popped in from a link that we've sent out, make sure to send us a message so that we know you want to get that material when we have the video and transcript available. You can just send us a quick email to info@newswise.com and we will make sure to put you on the list to get all that info when we have it available later tonight and tomorrow. We should have those materials. We'll be getting started in just a minute and introducing our panelists and beginning with questions. Welcome to this Newswise Live Expert Panel. We have today 4 panelists from different universities working with Newswise to talk about their research and their expertise on different aspects of the current pandemic. In particular, the question of where's the beef? What's up with food shortages and other topics related to supply chain, other kinds of products that are necessary during the pandemic, as well as info about exercise, nutrition, and fitness that are related to those possible food shortages and other concerns. I will share my screen here real quick and show a little bit of info about each expert as I go through and introduce them. We have with us today, we have Stella Volpe. She's the chair of the Nutrition Sciences and also professor at Drexel University. To contact Stella, you can reach her through the communications office at the ILSI, who have helped to bring her to our panel today. Steve Gibb is the contact for her. We've also got Dr. Benjamin Ruddell. He is assistant professor at the School of Informatics, Computing and Cyber Systems at Northern Arizona. The contact info for him is Heidi Toth. She's the assistant director in communications there at Northern Arizona. We also have Matti Kummu from Aalto University. The contact for him is Mark Fletcher there at Aalto. And we also have Carmen Martino. He is the director of the Occupational Training and Education Consortium at Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. And the communications contact for him is Steve Flamish. His info is there. If you are registered for today's event, and when we send you the video and transcript of everything, you'll be able to see all that contact information for each panelist there with the info that we share with you after today's concluded. So I want to go ahead and get started without any delay on this topic with questions for Ben Ruddell there at Northern Arizona. Ben, you've done a lot of research and data science about supply chains and how they respond to different shocks and disruptions. So what has your research told us about the flexibility and the resilience of supply chains in a crisis like this?
I'm the director of the Fusion Project, which has provided national maps of supply chains, and those include supply chains for pharmaceuticals, food products, et cetera. What we found is by looking at the network structure, points of vulnerability and weakness. And I can say that we've been pretty lucky so far in this crisis for the most part, because we haven't hit most of those points of weakness. But we have hit at least one, which is food processing. Our food supply chain is concentrated, particularly at the food processing step. So there's not that many factories that process your food for restaurants and grocery stores. And if they get compromised, for example, by health code or by infections in the food processing facilities, those bottlenecks really hurt. And that's what we're seeing right now. Other areas are much more flexible and resilient. And so they haven't been affected as much.
So you described the vulnerabilities in food production and especially meat as bottlenecks. Presumably, a certain amount of products needing to go through a limited number of processing plants. Is that the issue, or what other kind of vulnerabilities create those bottlenecks, and how could you describe that for us?
Well, what I mean here by bottleneck is that it's not very diverse. We only have a limited number of food processing facilities, and losing either one or two takes a big bite out of whatever product, like pork or beef. And so because we've had those outbreaks in those facilities, it really hurts. On the flip side, for example, our farms are much more diverse. There's thousands, hundreds of thousands of different farm entities. And so if you lose a few of them or things go wrong in a few locations, we're much more diversified and resilient in that step. We're also much more diversified and resilient in our distribution, warehousing, our trucking, and also our retail supply chains. There's a lot of different providers, a lot of diversity, and that allows us to be adaptive and flexible and to compensate. So it's really all about your adaptive options during a crisis. And so if you have a lot of diversity in the system, a lot of different providers and options, you have more flexibility to shift and adapt and prevent a shock.
Great, thank you, Ben. If any of the media in attendance today have questions for Ben, please let us know. I'm getting one right now from a freelancer here, Sophie Cavani. Sophie, if you'd like to ask this question yourself, we'd love for you to do so. I'll come back to Professor Ruddell here shortly. I want to go next to Carmen Martino at Rutgers. Professor Martino, working with studying the kinds of laborers, the kinds of workers in these industries. What can you tell us about why they're particularly vulnerable, and who makes up those workers, you know, in terms of socioeconomic status, as well as things like being vulnerable to certain health disparities?
So the population that does this work is primarily folks of color, and it's made up, a large portion of the workforce is undocumented. And these are folks who have a lot of risk factors with regard to the virus. So it puts them in a difficult place right from the beginning. The other thing that's very problematic with the workforce is the way the work is organized itself, and workers essentially work on top of each other, and they literally side by side on assembly lines, if you will, and they do as many as 10,000 cuts a day, depending upon what it is we're cutting up, whether it's poultry or beef or whatever. But it's a job that is difficult. It wasn't always a job that was low wage, historically speaking. These jobs were at one point higher paying jobs, decent paying middle class jobs. This would be back in the late 70s, going into the 80s. And the industry went non-union. It went aggressively after the workforce that was organized, and the conditions that exist now in large part have a lot to do with the fact that the workers are not represented in most situations. And again, the other part of it is as a vulnerable workforce, and a high percentage of the workforce, depending upon the location, includes undocumented workers who obviously, you know, at the moment, they're essential. On other occasions, they're very expendable and deportable. So it's a workforce that's not likely or not often in a position to stand up for itself.
And the workers in these industries being really the key factor in the decision about how to reopen and whether it's safe to reopen. What policies are in place to protect these workers and their families, as well as the communities where they work and live? Because if they're going in and out of these, you know, plants, and they're potentially spreading the virus, it's not just the workers themselves, but it's everyone else they come in contact with.
Yes. To back up just for a second, so most of them, these are low wage jobs, and the folks that work in these jobs go back to communities where it's, you know, it's probable that it's not just a single family home with a mom and dad and two kids. It's aunts, it's uncles, it's relatives, it's co-workers who live together in many situations. So their circumstances are such that there's going to be a higher probability that the virus, if they brought it home, could be spread. Now, as in terms of enforcement or who regulates the industry that would protect workers on the job, it's OSHA. In this situation, and this has happened before, OSHA is basically been benched, if you will. They're on the sidelines in this situation. There is no standard for COVID-19. There was some movement a few years back under the Obama administration to try to install a standard for viruses of this sort that might get into the workplace, but it was never completely, the work was never completely finished. And when the Trump administration came in, it's just kind of a dead letter at this point. So there's nothing there to enforce other than what OSHA provides under its general duty clause, which does give them the authority to go in and enforce in situations where workers are being exposed to things that aren't necessarily written into a standard that you would enforce. But again, the way OSHA has handled this up to this point, all they've got are the CDC guidelines that have been posted for everyone. To add to that, where the employers are in a situation now where they've got the president of the United States leaning in on them to stay open. Not that he necessarily has the legal authority that he says he has, but when the president leans in on you, you tend to listen. So the employers are in a place where, okay, we got to go to work every day. Everybody goes to work every day. And there is no regulation to limit or to at least define what the workplace needs to look like in terms of safety as regards to exposing people to the virus. And so here we are. And we have these high concentrations of spaces where workers are being exposed and whole plants are being shut down at times.
Thank you for that. If any of the media in attendance have questions for Professor Martino, please do chat them to us. I want to go next to Matti Kummu at Aalto University in Finland. Matti, we have a question in the chat that I think is going to be a good one for you. So I want to invite Sophie to ask this. Sophie, I'm going to go ahead and enable your audio, and you're live here with Professor Martino so that you can ask your question.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Hi. Hello, everyone. Yeah, my question was broadly speaking about the direction of animal proteins. So I was just wondering, given the bottlenecks that were mentioned earlier, do you see or can you guess whether at least post the lockdown over the next 12 months, would you see a move towards, and this is obviously based on massive headlines saying, you know, plant-based foods have won out, oat milk's gone up by 300%, but everybody's also buying cheap meat and bacon and a lot of sort of poultry and processed fish. So would you see a move toward intensive farming, or ideally more FTC, farmer to consumer? And if it is farmer to consumer, would that mean a kind of a broadening out of the local slaughterhouses? Could that be possible from that angle?
Matti, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, thanks, Sophie and Tom. Sure, we have been working on a global scale, though, the kind of how close to the food people live. In the US, the situation is pretty good because you are producing a lot of extra food for exports as well. But I at least what I'm seeing here in Europe, I'm coming from Finland, it's for sure going more kind of towards this farmer to consumer. More also in France, there has been signs that people are much more interested in local food. However, saying that, this is the option in only very few countries, including France, US, for example. The 80% of the global population live in countries where they are dependent on imported food, at least to some extent. So yes, in ideal situation, of course, it would go to that. But then I think the intensive farming, given the population is growing and we need more food, I think it's a kind of probably an idealistic way of seeing it. I personally think it could be doable if we radically reduce the meat consumption, and so we free the crop fields to direct human food. So I think there are many ways. Reducing the food waste, for example, would give much more opportunities to harvest locally. But at the moment, if we continue business as usual, it's no go.
You mentioned one of the challenges. You mentioned one of the challenges to a more local or regional sourcing of meat directly from farmers to consumers. A challenge there being that some countries, on the whole, are reliant on importing most of their food. Is that the kind of factor that makes these kinds of supply chains not resilient to major shocks? And what other factors make food supplies not resilient to those shocks?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the Ben mentioned that the main vulnerability in US has been in the processing, but then in US again, it's in a very favorable position because you're a food exporter, one of the largest in the world. But then there's other countries who are dependent on the global markets. Then this is the first shock in the modern history, so to speak, that hits to every part of the food supply chain and every country in the world. So it's really and no country has been able to prepare for this kind of a shock. So it's not only that it's shocking the processing. For example, in Europe, the shock goes directly to production because the seasonal workers, they cannot cross the borders. Some countries, they are already banning the exports, like Vietnam and Kazakhstan. And there are some export hindering. It takes much more time because there is no labor force to load the ships. So it really goes to also the consumers. Unemployment, it might impact the ability to purchase food. So this is the really first time on a history that there is a shock that hits every country, every part of the food supply chain. So the resilience to this kind of shocks, this is a interesting test from that perspective for sure.
And you're predicting a potential boost for solar-based foods and alternative proteins? This is a kind of follow-up that Sophie chatted to me after her question.
Yeah, I think that there has been over the last decades, really the self-sufficiency of many countries has dropped. But already before this pandemic, there has been a kind of reason of the realization that, okay, we need to increase the self-sufficiency. And for sure, this kind of solar-based food or the other kind of locally managed and food systems, they will for sure, or vertical farming on other very intensive, quite expensive still, but the price is coming down. For sure, I'll see the future that this pandemic is positively impacting the investments on this kind of systems.
Okay, thank you. I want to go next to Stella Volpe at Drexel. And Stella, building off of a response there from Matti about decreased meat consumption potentially being a benefit to growing a better food supply for the world. What's your perspective on lower meat consumption and its impact on the health of Americans as well as people around the world?
Sure, Tom. So, lower meat consumption can certainly lead to decreased chronic disease. It's been well established that a higher plant-based diet leads to lower cholesterol, lower risk of diabetes, lower body weight generally in people. And so so from a health standpoint, this really helps people. And from an environmental standpoint, it helps people. Because even if we just had one meatless meal a day, we could decrease the carbon footprint equal to more than taking off 26 million cars off the road. If half the population did that in the United States alone, that would happen. It also decreases water usage by up to 200,000 gallons. So from a health perspective, it's great because people typically will reduce weight without even trying so hard, if you will, because plant-based foods are lower in energy and calories, as well as helping the carbon footprint.
And what alternatives to a diet high in meat would you recommend? Even just the recommendation of going one day with no meat consumption is a good one. Are there other types of diets that, as a rule, include less meat, like for example the Mediterranean diet or something else like that?
Oh, you hit right there, right? We're both Italian, Tom, so we know that Mediterranean diet has also been shown to be very helpful for people, and that puts meat sort of at the bottom of their pyramid, where it's more of a side and not so much a main part of the meal. And including things like beans and hummus and tofu. You don't even have to, if people hate tofu, more beans in one's diet can really help with both protein, lowers the cost of their meals. And for right now in quarantine too, buying canned beans really is helpful for this shelf life that people don't have to go shopping as often.
So a big question that's part of this related to whether food supplies will be disrupted is about the fact that people being social distancing and being on various lockdowns and other stay-at-home advisories, we're doing all the grocery shopping and cooking meals at home rather than eating at restaurants. The proportion of that has changed dramatically. How has the shift how has that shift impacted people's ability to make good nutrition choices? And what suggestions do you have for people to make better nutrition choices while shopping during the pandemic?
Yeah, so early on, I think a lot of people were eating a lot more comfort foods. And I just read an article yesterday that actually the energy or the calorie intake of people has decreased during this pandemic because they are cooking more at home. They're making better choices in general. And therefore, weight gain has actually been either none at all or just a little bit. So that article actually surprised me because I think people are choosing to eat more healthily. Some things that they can do that are very easy to do. One of the things I love to make is a vegetarian chili, or if people do want some meat in there, to maybe put ground turkey or ground chicken, and it can be just a small part so they don't have to buy a lot of it. And then they can portion that across in the freezer and have some for themselves and their family over a week's time. And although eggs are animal-based, they are also an inexpensive source of good protein. And people can make omelets and they can make egg sandwiches and add vegetables to them so that they get vegetables with their meal. And then another sort of way that people can have healthier diets and not have to shop as often is buying frozen vegetables and fruits so that they can store them. Their shelf life will obviously be much longer, and they still provide a great source of nutrients.
You mentioned an article about this topic. If we could possibly share that link, I think I'm getting a chat from one of the reporters in the meeting. They'd love to see that, if it'd be possible to find that for us.
Okay.
We can include that in the transcript for you, Sophie. Thank you, Stella. I want to go back to Ben. Ben, we're talking about people doing more of their shopping because they're not eating at restaurants, being on social distancing. We're having to cook all of our meals at home, or most of them anyway. How has this shift been part of the disruption in food supply chains? What's the difference between things going from farms to wholesale for restaurants versus going to grocery stores for retail consumers?
Muted. So this has been mostly a positive story about the flexibility and resilience of the modern food supply chain, I think. What you've seen here is a shift in the United States from the supply chain at the customer end running mostly roughly 50-50 through restaurants versus grocery stores. And that shifted in the space of just a week or two to being over 95% running through grocery stores. So the grocery stores and their suppliers had to double the volume of service, and restaurants and their suppliers dropped to near zero. The amazing thing is that has gone so well, and it's gone so well because of a combination of free enterprise, and tens of thousands of different warehousing and distribution companies that do that. And the fact that companies are able to flexibly shift from providing food to restaurants to running it through the grocery supply chain instead. So, you know, it's a story where when you have a diversity of transportation and distribution systems and a lot of motivated, incentivized, and flexible private enterprises doing that work, as we do in the United States, they were able to pivot rapidly and massively to make that work. And they have made it work almost perfectly. There have been very few glitches in that transition, although I'm sure that we could find some pretty easily, so some glitches if we want to. Mostly it's a story of resilience.
Wonderful. Thanks for clearing that up. And on that further topic about some of these pivots and shifts within the industries, another question from Sophie Cavani at she's a freelancer. Sophie, I've made your audio live if you wanted to ask this question about intensive farming increasing.
Yeah, well, actually now I have two questions. So the first one was, could joblessness and a looming recession in fact increase people's need for cheap animal protein? So basically, do you feel that's a risk, that in fact, even as consumers, you know, we all, even as alternatives are filling the shelves and people are talking about them, is there a risk that people actually end up buying in the longer term cheaper cuts of meat. So, and that clearly comes from intensive farming. And then the other thing I was just interested in there was the shift, because clearly in Europe, where I am, that pivot has not been so good, because we've turned to the EU for what they call storage aid, particularly for things like milk and steak, not mince, but steak, and basically the more expensive cuts of meat and some of the dairy powders. So are you looking to Europe and seeing, oh my God, they didn't make that pivot, whereas we did? That last question was for the last speaker, sorry. And the first question was for Stella, really.
So Sophie, sorry. So you want me to jump in here? Are you talking about, I was so listening, yet I thought they were all going to Ben. So my apologies.
No.
Were you talking about the first part? I believe you asked about cheaper cuts of meat. And then my guess is you were talking about that with health, right?
Well, no, actually more, do you think that just by our behavior, given joblessness, recession, we could end up buying cheaper meat that would, in fact, boost factory farming?
Yeah, yes, sorry to interrupt you. Yes,
Yep.
I think that is a risk, because obviously if people are losing their jobs and yet they still want to buy meat products, they're going to go for the cheaper cuts, which again, my head was going toward the negative impacts on health, but yes, the negative impacts on the environment as well. Absolutely, I would agree with that.
How much of a risk do you think that is? Can you, like over the next 12 months, is there any way of quantifying that?
Wow, Ben, I might have to go to you on that one, because that's a little bit more your area than mine, I think. Not to put you on the spot.
Ben, could you weigh in on this?
I don't have a number to pull from a recent publication, unfortunately, but I think that the thesis is basically on point. With the economic disruption, the loss of income, that's going to cause people to need to eat less expensive food. And what we know about food supply chains is that the main benefits of the industrial and national and global scale food supply chain that we've built in the last 40 years are that it provides less expensive food and food that is more resilient to local disruptions in the system. And those are two benefits we need desperately right now from the structure of the system as a whole. And so, I expect that what you're guessing at there is going to happen. I expect that there's going to be a decrease in demand in expensive food, an increase in demand for less expensive food, and that is going to be predominantly industrial food. At the same time, I predict that in coming years, there's going to be a renewed emphasis in many rich urban areas on knowing where their food comes from and how secure that supply chain is, and a growing interest in food self-sufficiency. So I think that once we move out of this crisis, I would look for boosted interest in gardening and local food, local farming, especially in cities and local and urban areas.
Thank you.
And Sophie, was there another part of that question that we didn't get to with Ben yet?
Yes, I just can't remember what it was right now.
Okay.
Sorry, at the end he was talking about, so yes, a shift to more intensive factory farming, and then we were talking, I can't remember the last bit of what we were talking about. I have my main answer for now. I'll think of it again. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Sophie. If anybody else has questions for any of our panelists, please do chat to us and we'll allow you to ask them, or we can ask them on your behalf. I want to go to Carmen again for some more questions about kind of the reopening of some of this industry and the labor force there. Professor Martino, if a lot of these plants reopen and they then become themselves the centers of new hotspots, are they just going to have to close all over again? And what would the impact be on those workers and those businesses, as well as the supply on our local store shelves?
Well, it ventures out of my field when we start to talk about what the implication or how many people could be sick again, get sick again, and that public health area is not my field of expertise. But what I would say is that there seems to be a movement underfoot in the U.S. right now as we speak to sort of want to reopen everything. And I think that there are enough situations where there are some places around the country where there are not necessarily shortages of meat, but there seems to be places where you show up in some grocery stores and there's not as much there as there was. In a few places, things have been emptied out in a few places. So there's some, I think there's going to be some concern about it, right? But having said that, I'm very worried about what's going to happen because so far it looks like the places that are reopening are doing sort of what the states are doing that might need to be rethinking that, which is to say not very much. They don't have systems in place to, they're not checking people at the door before they go in to see if they're sick or not. They're not testing enough people in the facilities based on what my knowledge is of it thus far. There's not a system in place for keeping track of people. Most states don't have good tracking systems, contact tracers to do this kind of work. So I'm very worried that we're just it's gonna happen again. And then what happens in the aftermath of that? Well, my hope is that we get our act together and we do start doing what needs to be done to isolate the virus and to make sure that when people get it, they can be quarantined and the workforce can continue to work. But it seems to me that unless they do the testing and unless they have the system in place to keep track of folks who might have the virus, and this is all within the facilities, and unless they, I think, also need to start thinking in terms of how they spread the workforce out, maybe slow production down a little bit, do things like stagger shifts in ways that allow workers to go and have lunch breaks without everybody being piled in on top of each other, without having everyone all coming at once to work. Things like that can be done, I think, to slow things down a little, but to make the workplace safer, to get track of the virus potentially if it's in the workspace. I think it's all possible, but I don't have any indication right now. It doesn't seem to me that any of it's being done in any concerted way, maybe in a few isolated places, but not generally.
Thank you, Carmen. I want to ask Matti, what do you think that governments can do, as well as industries within food production, to better prepare for these kinds of global shocks that you researched, the pandemic as well as other disruptions? What can we do to prepare for that?
Sure. Yeah, Ben already mentioned that the kind of diversity in each part of the food supply chain is the key. So he also mentioned a couple of very good examples from the US, how the diversity has been kind of enabled to move from one stage to another very quickly. So I think the diversity in both food production and in the import connections and during the whole supply chain, I think it's one of the key. Of course, also the food self-sufficiency was already mentioned. So that will be for sure increasing. And then the food reserves, which were quite common during the Cold War, those have been shut down, at least, or reduced significantly in most parts of the world, because the global market has been able to supply, so it's quite expensive to keep these food reserves. But at least according to some speculation, or those will probably be started again. And of course, this puts them to decreases a little bit in the terms of couple of years, the availability in the global markets. And also the kind of not only self-sufficiency in food production itself, but also the agricultural inputs such as fertilizers, seeds, and machinery, and whatever you need for the agriculture. So I think these are one of the key things that can be done. And of course, I'm sure each nation will be starting to make more proper plans on how to better prepare to this kind of shocks in the near future or far future.
So on the topic of meat production, more specifically, it's been mentioned that there's some inefficiencies kind of fundamentally in growing food to then feed to animals and then humans consuming those animals. Can you describe more about what that what that process is like and what that inefficiency means for the system? You talked about lower meat consumption, for example, freeing up more farmland for growing food directly for people rather than for cows, for example. Can you explain more about that?
Sure, yeah. So part of the meat production is sustainable also because the cows or other animals, they eat products or kind of side products from the farming that are unusable directly for humans. So in that sense, in part of it's for sure it's needed, it provides good protein, but roughly like almost half of the global cropland goes to the animal feed. And for example, cow is very inefficient. Every calorie you put in a way to the cow, you get 5 to 10% back. And in protein wise, same. Chicken is much more efficient, but still you lose roughly 60 to 80% of the calories you feed to a chicken rather than you would eat it yourself. Of course, I mean, you cannot compare. It's not as simple as that. But then, so it's not efficient for sure. We have been doing, for example, from resource point of view, water scarcity. 50% of the population lives under water scarcity, and the water footprint of the vegetarian meal it's much less than the heavy meat-based meal.
You brought up water, and I know you've done a lot of other research about water and access to water around the world. That's another big factor in animal protein farming, that the need for such large amounts of water for these animals and the production of that. That may be under pressure in the future as access to water in some parts of the world for people is threatened, right?
Sure, yeah. Already now, most people live in under some sort of water scarcity, and we cannot free up more arable land, so that's already in use. Basically, we don't want to cut the rainforest. We can for sure we can use the water more efficient. We can again reduce the food losses, which again we would also reduce the use of resources going to food production. And according to our yet unpublished study, we found that depending on how you do the diet change, so towards the less meat. So for example, already 30 to 30%, so cutting the meat production to 30, or meat consumption 30% by 30%, we could already save most of the water. After that, the meat production is actually quite sustainable from water perspective. So not huge cuts. We don't need to go vegan to save the resources, but there is room.
Thank you, Matti. Stella, does scarcity of products affect people's nutrition choices?
So typically, yes, scarcity of products will affect people's nutrition choices. Typically, as we have seen in this pandemic, people will try to get as much as possible of those food sources that have been more scarce, like meat, the non-food sources like toilet paper, and even the canned foods, which is, again, as I said earlier, that's good. People can get great nutritious meals from them. What has been happening, I'm sure, in all of your areas is that stores have now limited what people can buy, typically to 2 packs of meat, for example, so that we have more for others. What that can do to people, though, as far as their intake is, I think generally what people have done is they try to get a lot and freeze a lot so that they have it over time. And from a standpoint of, that makes a lot of sense, right? But from a standpoint of ensuring that enough people have it, the fact that stores have limited access is a very good way to move forward.
What other tips do you have about maintaining good physical activity and good nutrition choices during this pandemic?
Sure. So the one thing is to try to keep your meals regular as much as you possibly can, the 3 meals a day, or if people eat 6-minute smaller meals throughout the day, to try to be as regular as you can. And when it comes to physical activity, I love to exercise. I know that some people went into this pandemic probably still hating to exercise, but that we're at our computers a lot more, those of us who aren't on the front lines. And so if they can think about getting up every hour, even if it's to walk around their apartment, if they have an outdoor area to walk that's safe and they can be socially distant, to walk outside. If you have dogs like my husband and I do, we definitely have to take them for multiple walks. Aside from the physical activity that we get, they're now working out with us, which is kind of funny. So it makes it sort of fun to be with us.
And right on cue.
Oh, did you actually hear that? Yes.
That's hilarious.
Right before we started, I'm like, oh my goodness. So they're happy right on the enclosed porch right now. So I didn't know if you could hear them, Tom, two big German Shepherds. So they require a lot of activity. And the one thing is for people and for activity is my little motto has always been BTN, better than nothing. So something is always better than doing nothing. Even if someone started this pandemic not being very active, 5 minutes a day will still be better than not doing anything at all, of just simple walking.
Thank you, Stella. Ben, we have another question from Sophie in the chat. The follow-up that she had meant to ask earlier, and we kind of got into another question. Sophie, would you like to ask that?
Yeah, hi, sorry, I remember the question. It was about, so you said that America had managed to successfully pivot from food service to basically retail. Now in Europe, what seems to be happening with beef, more expensive cuts of meat and a lot of milk, things like butter and powder and all of that, they're all going now into storage because the EU is offering private storage aid. Have you heard about that, or are you looking at that and thinking, gosh, what does that say to you if you'd heard about it?
I think that now first, my work's mostly US focused. So that's where I have my biggest expertise. But I think that what this shows you is that these are critical supply chains. We're talking about them because this is an emergency. During emergencies, you realize that there are some parts of the economy, the supply chain and the infrastructure that are far more important than others. That is, they're far more fundamental. Food is one of those, also medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, telecommunications, fuel, electricity, water, stuff like that. I think what this is showing you is that in critical parts of the economy and the supply chain, the government has a large and important regulatory role, which is very consequential. And so what you just mentioned highlights a difference in the regulatory and management structure for critical food supply chains between the US and Europe. I think that during the forensics we will do after this emergency, it will become very clear which governmental approaches to regulating critical supply chains are more effective. And I think we need some major reform in all countries to deal with critical supply chain regulation. I'll give you a couple more examples though. The medical equipment and pharmaceutical components of the supply chain in the United States have been a huge mess. And I think that's largely due to a failure of the federal government to properly recognize that those are critical supply chains and to properly support stockpiling, domestic self-sufficiency in production, and diverse supply chains and US domestic supply chains for medical supplies and pharmaceuticals. We get all of our pharmaceuticals, all is an exaggeration. We get a large fraction of our pharmaceuticals from overseas. We didn't have enough production capacity sitting on the sidelines to backfill that, or especially to backfill medical equipment. These things need to be regulated. They need to be regulated properly. So I won't criticize Europe's approach. What I'll say is it's too late for this disaster, but we need to be much more ready for the next one as governments in the area of critical supply chains.
Thank you, Ben.
Tom, could I ask you a question? Could I just jump in?
Carmen, yes, please. Absolutely.
So we've been talking about the diversity of supply chains and how nimble the U.S. appears to be in some situations, not so much in others. But one of the things I think that that it gets lost in this is that where you have supply chains that are very diverse, where you usually have lots of contractors, and that's what makes the supply chain diverse. You can move from one party to the next, and those contractors usually are not so interested in being employers any more than the people who need stuff on their shelves at a Walmart or a Target, or, you know, everybody just wants their stuff moved quickly. But the only way you get that diversity and that movement is by having a workforce that's very easy to use and drop off and pick up whenever you need it. So what you'll find with a lot of contractors and the subcontractors is that they use temporary workers. Our supply chains are filled with temporary workers all over, all the way. You can find temporary workers all the way back to China's supply chains for lots of goods that we purchase from there. So all along the way, there are temporary workers or workers who are subcontractors or subcontractors. This is what makes these jobs low wage. And this is what creates horrible conditions in many situations for these workers. And it's not just the meat packing industry. You pick the supply chain and I'll find the contractor and the temp agency that goes with it and the low wage worker that's attached to it somewhere down the line. So it's important to point out, because on the one hand, I think a diverse supply chain is important in being able to address a problem like we have right now, clearly. But on the other hand, if we lose sight of the people who are actually moving the goods, and if those people can't make a decent living, and if their conditions of work are horrible, then it's something we have to take a look at. And it's something that we don't have enough, that people don't have enough information about or are aware of. You know, you push the button every day and you hit send, and the next thing you know, whatever you ordered is at the front door tomorrow, right? And how it got there, we don't know and we don't ask. And that's worth pointing out here, I think.
Yeah, great points. Thank you. For either for you or for Ben, any thoughts about how long it would take for an operation like Smithfield or Tyson, who have closed plants, to get back to full operation?
So I'll give a short answer, and this is based on what little I know about, you know, meat processing operations. I'm not an expert in that operational area, but I understand that this is limited entirely by the sickness of workers. And so those operations have the exact same problems that the rest of our society does. In other words, this is going to be with us for a while. You know, where are they going to get healthy workers from who aren't going to get infected? They are waiting on vaccinations, testing regimes, especially testing regimes, which need to be aggressively implemented in critical areas of the supply chain with workers to protect their health and to ensure operations. I think this is going to be a lingering problem that's going to come and go in meat processing operations and in other areas that are affected by the illness until we can solve the broader problem.
We have another question from the chat from one of our media attendees, Susan Solaski from the Detroit Free Press. Are you able, Ben, to differentiate between the different kinds of animal protein production and one or the other being more affected by supply chain disruptions? For example, pork, beef, chicken, would one be able to regroup more quickly than others?
So that's a good question. I can differentiate in the data. We can dig into that, although it's a bit of work. In the FewView tool that's on the internet, you're going to find all meat and seafood lumped into one supply chain category. So you'll be able to see that for the U.S. economy in some detail. My interpretation of the difference at this point, and I could be proven wrong by work over the next year or two that digs into the details, you know, but my interpretation is that this is a matter of luck so far. I don't think that there are large differences between those different types of proteins. I think that you're experiencing outbreaks due to luck and chance in some areas and not in others. And I think that probably other areas will be hit that haven't been so far, if my logic holds. So there's an element of chance in these systems. We are lucky. I was telling Tom before, we're lucky that New York City, which has been hit the hardest in the United States, is not a major supply chain hub in a lot of areas, like for food production or energy, the way that Chicago or Los Angeles is, right? So that was luck. And I think there's an element of luck here too. or bad luck, as the case may be. Resilience, though, resilient systems help you deal with bad luck. That's the key. It's the difference between bad luck taking a system down versus a system bouncing back.
So we've talked a lot about if the meat supply chain is majorly disrupted, some of the effects being, lower meat consumption, which could be a positive for public health, and maybe less food waste or less inefficient food production. Are there, a lot of those things sound like positives. What are some more of the risks to these industries? Like how many people they employ, for example, or other factors that might be worth considering. I want to ask Ben also if you could explain a little bit more from your perspective, a question I asked to Matti earlier about kind of the carbon footprint and the inefficiency of meat production. What can you tell us about that?
Okay, brief answer to the first question, and then I'll answer the second in more length. I think the other than the supply chain risk of not having meat, the human toll of this situation is gigantic, and it's the main cost. The employees, when I talk about resilience, it can sound a little bit glib. When I talk about shifting from one part of the supply chain to another and being nimble, every time that happens, there's big winners and losers. This is a shock that's going on, and it is ordinary people and primarily the workforce that loses their jobs that is affected most severely by that, right? And so that is the major risk. It's the major cost of these shocks. And it's a great reason to avoid them in the future. To your second question, so there was already some great answers given by Matti and others on environmental impacts and footprints of supply chains. It is right that meat in general and beef specifically has the highest footprints on the environment of any area of our food supply. And in fact, beef consumption is one of the largest environmental impacts that any person makes on the planet. If you compare it to all kinds of human behaviors and consumption, that is one of the biggest footprints. And that's true in terms of water quality. It's true in terms of water consumption. It's true in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, land use. The cattle use a lot of resources. So I want to point the media to a specific example which I found particularly interesting. So I helped Brian Richter earlier this year with a paper that mapped out beef supply chains and consumption and their water footprints in the Western US. Western US is one of the most water stressed places in the world. It's also a big beef producing region. And we were, there's a cool take home fact. We were able to demonstrate that the people of Los Angeles, the citizens of Los Angeles, use more Colorado River water through their beef consumption than they take out of the Colorado River in their aqueduct. That's the main water supply for the city. So think about that. By eating beef that's produced using Western alfalfa, which is irrigated using Colorado River water, that uses more water from the Colorado River than all of the factories, lawns, and showers and all the drinking water for the city of Los Angeles, or roughly similar, actually.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Another question for Matti there at Aalto University. What other threats are you looking at that may arise in the coming months that would be a major disaster on top of the pandemic in disrupting global food production? And how many people would it affect? What could that look like?
Sure, yes. I have been already, of course, before the pandemic, I have been looking the famine in Africa and other parts. So already without this crisis, there were roughly 130 million people suffering of acute hunger. And this is predicted to double this to more than 250 million people globally. So there are, for example, conflicts in the Middle East, Northern Africa, Horn of Africa, putting Yemen, for example, already 17 million people going close to famine there. The locust invasion in Horn of Africa now spreading also to the Middle East. might cut the yields there by several tens of %. And so particularly that part of the world, it will be really, like they called, FAO called it the perfect storm. So there are like multiple stressors, and this pandemic is just on top of this everything else. It's really close to collapsing the societies, the food security, and others. So, and on top of that, the donors, like big donors, US, EU, they are suffering. They are now kind of concentrating on their own crisis, unable probably to free enough money to help this situation. So we'll see. Yeah, I'm very concerned on the situation over there, and that's just one of the examples globally.
Thank you, Carmen. What can you tell us about research that's being done with an OSHA grant that you're working on about food processing and health and safety in the workplace in this kind of situation?
So we have several grants that the Occupational Safety and Health Administration offers Susan Hardwood training grants annually. And we've been able to secure those over a period of years. Primarily, we worked with low-wage workers in New Jersey, and a lot of the work that we've done historically is with warehouse workers, more recently with restaurant workers, and we've worked with poultry workers actually on a project in North Carolina not too long ago, helping them out with developing a training program for health and safety training program for workers who worked in the poultry industry down there. A lot of our research historically has been based on trying to figure out ways that we can get employers to recognize that their workers are their best resources with regard to health and safety, and that if workers are knowledgeable about what the regulations are, what the standards are, they're the best people to be in a position to enforce them and to keep the workplace safe. And it works best in situations where employers have given workers or workers have fought for the opportunity to have a voice at the table, to be able to have health and safety committees that work on equitable terms, where the workers feel confident and comfortable about talking about what their concerns are, and the employers address them on equitable terms, and they're able to solve problems. So a lot of our research historically has been driven in that direction in a variety of industries. And the formula is pretty much the same, regardless of the industry. If workers have a voice, if they have a health and safety committee in place that allows them to identify problems, and they feel comfortable going to management with the problems, then problems are solved and the workplaces are safer. It's a pretty simple formula, but we've found that when it's implemented and the employer embraces it, and normally if there's a union in place, it works better. But we've seen it in situations where it doesn't necessarily have to be a union environment for it to work fairly efficiently.
Thank you. I want to bring us toward a close here. So I have one more question for each panelist that I want to do, and kind of a little bit of a lightning round, if you can give a short answer to this question. And if there are any other questions from media in attendance, please do chat them to us and we'll get to it before we close up. But first, for each of you, what is one thing that you would like to change based on this discussion at this point in time that we are in, based on the way that you've looked at the situation and the data that you have access to and your expertise? Ben, what would you say is one thing that you would want to change?
So one thing I would want to change about how we handled the situation. Yeah. I think this shows the importance of preparedness and of social action, and both at the individual level and also in terms of government regulation in critical supply chains. At the same time, without disrupting the inherent resilience of a free market system, which I think has been one of our ingredients to success in the United States so far. So we have to strike that balance, but a little more of the regulation and social action, please.
Okay, Stella, what do you think would be something that you'd want to see changed?
so many, Tom, but I will say one is that we should have had much quicker testing for everyone, set up very quickly, just like many other countries have done very quickly. We needed to model other countries in doing that.
Matti?
Global cooperation. So instead of using the energy for fighting or accusing others, so to really work together and join the forces in each aspect, not only the testing or vaccine, but all aspects of the crisis.
Carmen, what would you change?
I would like to see workers have a real right to refuse unsafe work. And that includes when workers feel like their employer is not doing their due diligence to protect them from the virus, that the workers should have the opportunity to say, no, we're not going to work until this problem is resolved. And that's a universal right to refuse, not just for meat packers, but for anybody who might be exposed to the virus right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the experts for your wonderful insights and responses to our questions. Thank you to the media that have attended, especially for those of you who've given us questions. We will provide video and transcript of today's panel to you if you registered for today's event. If you did not register, but you'd like to get that video and transcript, just shoot us a quick email to info@newswise.com and we'll make sure that we get you on that list to get that information once we have it available, and we'll be able to give you access as well to the communications contacts to help you follow up with any of today's panelists if you have further questions for them. With that, we'll go ahead and close. So for Stella Volpe at Drexel University, Matti Kummu at Aalto University, Carmen Martino at Rutgers, and Ben Ruddell at Northern Arizona, thank you all very much. Thank you everyone for joining. Stay safe, stay well, and good luck.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tom and others.
Thank you.
See you all. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.